Well, here's another one. Just wanted to take a little time this Monday morning to give you guys a little watching material, some of you. Um, I usually have 200 or 300 people that watch these videos, but I've got something like 11,000 subscribers. I'm not exactly sure what that means, but it doesn't really matter anyway, because I'm just doing this for fun, and I hope you're benefiting from it. This one here centers around a Mazda 626, 96 model, 2-liter engine, 122,000 miles. And what had happened was, well, let me back up. And this is a little opening remark I had made. Every time things got a little more complicated, people would come to us. I don't know how many times you've seen this at your shop, or they would say, I had the engine replaced and then this happened and all that. And when I was working in the service department at the Ford dealer, I worked there for about 15 years. Of course, I did other things before and after that, but some of the mechanics on the other side of the shop, and I always thought this was kind of silly, they're all about nuts and bolts work. They can swap out engines and do stuff, and they were pretty good at that. But back in the day, some of you might remember that in the 80s, the vacuum schematics on some of the vehicles back then, well, the Ford vehicles anyway, looked like a road map of Clarksburg, West Virginia. They had all different colored plastic pipes going everywhere. And usually whenever the thing got a few miles on it, those plastic lines would get broke, and but they would put the engine in there, and those engine mechanics, rather than taking the time to go by the VECI decal under the hood and straighten out that vacuum, would have the service manager, dispatcher, put it over to me, and he'd put it over there for me to straighten out all the vacuum lines. My job was to do the final tune-up, or the tuning on it, to get it set up the way it was supposed to. And all I basically did was follow the vacuum schematic, and I'd use those little small rubber vacuum lines, and I'd build a little vacuum harness, going from point A to point B, just like wiring something up, one wire at a time. When it gets through, it looks like spaghetti. It looks like you really have some complicated knowledge, but I was basically just following the schematic and doing it. Long and short of it was, these guys, rather than piddle with all that stuff, they would surrender some flag time to me if I would take care of that, so that all they had to fool with was the nuts and the bolts. They didn't like electrical, they didn't like drivability and electronics. All they wanted to do was do nuts and bolts. Now, things are different now. I mean, this was long years ago. I mean, 25, 30 years ago. But one way or another, most of the shops seem to know what they're doing that I know about. I'm not here to trash a bunch of shops. But some customers won't even go back to the shop that did the work if something's not right. They just look for another shop to fix whatever's wrong. I don't know how many times I've seen this. They go to a shop that would probably make it right if they would go back and give them a chance to. But rather than doing that, they'll take it from the shop that did the original work to a different shop, and that different shop will do some work, and if it's still not right, they'll take it to a third shop hopping I call it. And by the time, if they go back to the first shop and said, you didn't fix this right, and had to take it to 2 other shops and it's still not right, well, the first shop's got every right to say, look, you should have brought it back to us first. Now that everybody else has been fooling with it, we're going to start all over. But anyway, I've always advised people when they would email me through my website. I don't have that website anymore because, if Joomla, blew up on it or whatever, and I didn't update it like I should. I closed the website down, not because I was tired of answering questions, but just because of issues with the website and keeping it up too much trouble. But people would say, went to this shop and I did this, and I said, look, you should have gone back to your original shop and let the original shop try to make it right before you did all this taking it from shop to shop. Anyway, this lady here worked with us, and they paid a local shop about $1,500 to put a salvage yard engine in it. Original engine had been knocking, and after the job was done, it didn't run well. It didn't run right, and they knew it didn't run right. And so she wanted us to check it out rather than taking it back to the shop to install the engine. All right. he described the problem as a vibration, and I immediately started thinking of driveline or wheel balance problems. You know, when somebody talks about a vibration, you're usually thinking about going down the road. Well, she wasn't talking about a vibration. She was talking about sitting still. She didn't like the way it ran. Now, when the Ford Contours, which is about the same car as this, came out back in the mid 80s, I'm sorry, the mid 90s, not the mid 80s, we were having a lot of complaints about those, steering wheel quivering and all this kind of stuff. And Ford came out with that engine didn't have a balance shaft in it. And because of the fact that a firing event on a four-cylinder, inline four-cylinder, only happens every 180 degrees of crankshaft rotation, it's going to be trying to bounce all the time because the pistons are doing this, you know. So that's why they have so many of the four-cylinder engines are built with balance shafts. Of course, some of your V6s are too and stuff. But the long and the short of it is, this one here was built without a balance shaft, so even when everything's right, you're liable to feel some steering wheel vibration. But this was something beyond what they had experienced before, and they wanted to see if we could get it straightened out so it would be an acceptable ride, because they didn't like the way it was here. So it turned out the vibration was when she was sitting still. And this one here was vibrating pretty bad. The mill light was on, although I didn't remember saying anything about that. So before we did the highway test drive, we plugged the NGS, you know, New Generation Star Tester, into the DCL and had a quick look at what was stashed in the memory. Okay, so you just look at your codes. You know, a lot of the times you can touch your fingers, do the walk, and look around under the hood and just see what you see. Then you go and pull your codes just to see what the engine controller has seen and stored. And then if it's, you know, if you want to, you can pull freeze frame data and that kind of thing to see the snapshot that the engine controller made. But in this particular case, the P codes we got showed the fuel control system had reached the maximum compensation of rich and lean. And I don't know how many times I've seen this. And typically, you know, back when I was doing a lot of drivability work at the Ford dealer, a lot of the time I would see situations where an oxygen sensor would just go flatline for a while, and then it would kick back in and start working. Well, when the oxygen sensor likes to go, goes flatline, what happens is it basically, the fuel trim goes positive as the O2 flatlines. This happens because the fuel trim system and the engine controller are saying, oh my goodness, it's lean. Well, when the oxygen sensor flatlines, it looks like a lean signal to the engine controller, and it's liable to jack those fuel trims way off up into the high double digits, you know. And then after it runs like that for a while, the stupid thing the oxygen sensor will say, oh my goodness, I went to sleep, let me wake up, and it will start shifting again. But what happens is it goes up high and stays up there, because now the fuel is, it's added a bunch of fuel for a perceived lean condition, and then as it starts to, step the short fuel trim up, responds first, and then the long fuel trim has to kick in to get everything balanced out. There's a lot of, that's why I like to look at long fuel trim when I'm going into one, because it gives you a lot better information on one that hasn't recently had the memory cleared than short fuel trim does. Anyway, I would be watching how that thing would do. And in those circumstances where the oxygen sensor is flatlining and then it goes high because the fuel trim is being jerked from pillar to post by a lazy oxygen sensor that, just fritzes out occasionally, you'll see the thing has gone on both sides of the spectrum. And I sort of figured on that. See, when the O2 wakes up, it goes up and it stays up until it clears it up. And if it remains persistent enough while the soot's burning off, the short and long fuel trims will drift into the -20, and now it had stashed the opposite code. Now, that can be intermittent, and it's not unusual to see one come in that the oxygen sensor is doing exactly like it's supposed to, and the fuel trims even look normal, but you have both of those codes stored in your memory. Things are a little different now than they used to. I have determined here in fairly recent history with the oxygen sensor thing, and I was around whenever they first started putting them on American cars. Oxygen sensors have become more, how would you put that, more dependable. They're not as likely to fritz out as they used to be. The heated oxygen sensor heaters will burn out, but that's the most common failure that I have seen in recent times. is the heater dying on the oxygen sensor, and it'll throw a code for something like that. All right. The Mazda wasn't running right though. The idle was too rough, and we looked into the data stream. We saw numbers that anything were proper. Fuel trims were dancing around the -25 mark. Everything else looked normal, with the exception of a mass airflow voltage. It seemed a little bit too high while it was idling. Okay, so that's important too, because I'll tell you this, mass airflow can read a little bit skewed. Not very much. It doesn't have to read very much out of kilter to throw your fuel trims completely off. I used to have a mass airflow sensor that I had saved from a repair job. And when I was started teaching, I got a 98 Ford Ranger that had been underwater in Allen Park, Michigan, and Ford Motor Company gave it to me. And it was just a perfect brand new truck when I got it. Yeah, it had been underwater, but you couldn't tell it wasn't a brand new truck. Anyway, I had this mass airflow sensor that I had saved from my mechanic days when I was teaching. And when I would give them the final exam for Engine Performance 1, I would replace the mass airflow sensor, because it was off of a Ranger like that, with one that was, and back in that, the way we were reading it on the NGS, we were reading the voltage. And the voltage usually hovers right close to a volt. You know, usually it'll be, 790 millivolts to, just under a volt. On this one here, the sensor that had the fuel trim was balanced really good, was reading about 790, and the one that I put on there was reading 810, which is not very much difference. But when you put that other mass airflow sensor on there and didn't change anything else, the fuel trims would go completely into the negative, something awful, because it was actually skewing the mixture to the point to where the oxygen sensors were picking up, and the engine controller was trying to balance it out, all because of a mass airflow sensor that would have never thrown a code. Now we call this an in-range failure. The code that it throws has got something to do with mix. Map sensors will do that too. They'll actually be reading high altitude and cause the fuel trims to go wacky and that kind of thing, so be prepared for that. Anyway, mass airflow voltage is a 0.7 to 1, but a little bit, just a little bit. Now, most scan tools read grams per second. Some of the scan tools will actually won't read grams per second. They'll read something that's a lot more coarse than that. I always like to set it on a metric reading where it'll read grams per second if I'm going to use that reading, because it's a higher resolution reading than some of the other ones that you try to get. Idle air bleed screw on this one here, which lets air go around the throttle plate, had been backed way out because they were trying to get it to idle a little smoother. That made the mass airflow a little higher because there was more air flowing, right? Okay, so basically we had to put that back where it was supposed to be. And we ran it back to its normal position, 650 to 750 RPM, with the idle air control valve disconnected and the coolant fan not running. I don't remember where I got those numbers, but anyway, we were, I won't take time to tell a little piece of the story. There was this guy who wasn't quite as experienced as I was with this drivability stuff at the Ford place. And he came over here and he said, I can't seem to get this thing to idle right. What I always did was I'd clean back in those days, I'd clean the idle air control and I'd clean the throttle body. And I'd have the battery cable off the whole time. And then with the idle air control disconnected, I would, people a lot of times had jacked around with that idle stop screw. I'd run it down to where it was about 550, and then you plug it in, you get it out of the dead band where the idle air control will be running 25 to 30% to keep it, where it wants it. Anyway, I gave him all those instructions. I said, well, do this, wash all that, and outdo and pull that off. I gave him specific instructions he was able to follow. And he came back over there and he says, well, that really took care of the whole problem. You must have seen this before. I said, no, I've never seen that before. I just knew what to do. And he grabs me by the throat. Ah! But anyway, it's funny. Or it's funny to me. It may not be funny to anybody else. But we weren't satisfied with the idle quality, let alone the scan tool readings, because mass airflow still seemed a little bit high. But we opted for a highway test drive. It ran a lot like it had a crack in the air inlet tube that would get wider with torque, but the problem only seemed to occur about 3/4 throttle. If he pushed his foot past 3/4 throttle, the car would hunker down like it was starving for fuel, or it would hunt, and this kind of thing. This was something, most Chrysler products use mass air mount rather than you know, for years they stayed away from mass airflow on anything that wasn't a, you know, like Eagle Summits and stuff like that were technically made by Chrysler. But anyway, most of their domestic ones and all, they like the map sensor better. Okay, so right at the 3/4 throttle level, the 626 would buck and jump, and below that, apart from the rough idle, the engine ran normally, albeit a little weak on takeoff. All right, so you got a wide open throttle here. I had to actually put that screen, you know, together. You see where I've spliced it. Anyway, and this was the readings that we had over here. This was, you know, mass airflow readings. They showed it to. But look at the oxygen sensors reading really lean, and the short fuel trim's at 33% when we're at wide open throttle. See what? So, all right, the voltage was sweeping smoothly all the way up from 1/2 volt to about 4.6 at wide open throttle. 1/2 volt's a little low. I always like for a Ford to be real close to a volt. A lot of your GM stuff like to be 1/2 volt, you know, whatever. But the O2 would go lean even though the PCM should have been delivering full enrichment at that load and throttle angle. All right, so what do you think? He said, well, we need to check the fuel pressure. Made sense. Let's have a look at the fuel pressure to see what it is. So we got our Mac fuel pressure gauge. And, you know, one of the things that was always wonderful about checking fuel pressure, if you didn't have one of these really nice kits that had a lot of adapters to it, sometimes you would have a hard time checking the fuel pressure because, you know, they had fuel pressure ports on just about everything that I was used to working on for a long time. But some of these Japanese cars, you'd have to pull a pulsation damper off or something like that and put a little, you know, a little banjo fitting type adapter in there to hook your fuel pressure gauge to. One way or another, that's what we had to do here, see. We had to put that special adapter in there. Well, unless it's pushing water or air, which it turned out this wasn't because the fuel was really good, we were holding a good strong 45 PSI, even deep into it. Now, here's the other thing. You might have seen another video I had over there. When I used to have, I would work on motorhomes sometimes, and people would come in with one of these big motorhomes that had an 80-gallon gas tank on it. And they'd say, we're losing power, we've got it full of gas and all, but blah, blah, blah. And so I would go and, first thing I do is I pull the engine cover off, and I put the fuel pressure gauge on it, because it'd have one of them, you know, 7.5s in it or whatever. And then I would look at that fuel pressure gauge, and with the fuel pressure regulator vacuum hose unplugged, I'd snap the throttle. When you snap the throttle, if you lose pressure, just snapping the throttle, you know it's going to lose pressure when you're pulling a hill. You know, and so I would have to put a fuel pump in the doggone thing. That was very, very common. We'd put a filter on it too, but we didn't have anywhere in the Ford place to put 80 gallons of gasoline. So I had to devise a way to safely lower that 80-gallon gas tank with all that gas in it. And it had little eyelets on either end, it had straps under it, and I would replace the bolts through the little eyelets on either end of the tank. Of course, it's pretty substantial eyelets with a piece of all thread on each side, you know, with the long thread going down. And then while that was holding the tank, I'd take the straps loose and I'd unhook the filler neck, and then I would had 2 air ratchets with 2 big long sockets. I had to hook onto them on all threads, and I could lower that gas tank all the way down, and then I'd replace the pump, and then I would raise it all the way back up, and it would go right back in place. I mean, it was just so perfect. Now, because all threads were long enough to where the tank would go all the way to the ground, and the nut would still be on the all thread, you see. And so anyway, long and the short of it was, that was how I handled that. But the way I found it, and the way I found a weak fuel pump on some other vehicles, because you're always going to do your filter first if you have this, pull the fuel pressure regulator hose, snap the throttle, see if it maintains pressure. If the pressure drops, there you go, you know. All right. So with the fuel pressure data behind us, we already had that. We looked closer at the sand tool reading. Now, at wide open throttle acceleration, we reiterated the discovery that both O2 sensors were reading lean, short fuel trim was high, mass airflow was at 2.78. Now that was bothering me right there, because it should have been higher than that. All right, it was incapable, it turned out, of reading more than 2.78 volts, even though the airflow was beyond that. And that's the input that the engine controller was paying attention to for its fuel delivery. Now this other stuff, this is the cause, this is the effect, that and the drivability problem. It's very significant, all these, if you look at them together. All right. Whenever we unplugged this and drove it, it ran a whole lot better. I also saw this on a Pontiac Aztec not long after this. we'd hit about 50 miles an hour, and that's all it would do. It felt like it had a potato in exhaust or something. When you unplugged the mass airflow sensor, it would run like a rocket because it was using different inputs. And the trash sensor reading from the mass airflow wasn't tripping things up. All right. Now, the smartest thing, and I taught this for years, if you want to get really good at figuring out what's wrong looking at scan tool readings, you need to get, every time you get a chance, you need to plug into a vehicle and look at how all that stuff's supposed to look. Because I did that. When I first started doing drivability all the time in 1986, that's Ford didn't even have any scan data at the time. They didn't have that until '88. It came out first on the Continental, and it was a few years later before we got on everything else. But the point is, I checked voltage on all the sensors on every car that came in, so that I got very used to what they were supposed to be. And then when I had one that was giving trouble, when I was checking, I got a long coat hanger, and I sharpened it on the end, and I put heat shrink tubing on it, and I hooked it to my meter lead so I could reach down in there wherever those things were, and I could back probe them or whatever I needed to do to get those voltage readings. And when I got used to what those voltages were supposed to read, I could fix them. You know, I tried to use that H manual for a while when I first came back from school. You know how when you go to school and you spend a few days in electronic engine performance school or whatever, and you come back ready to change the world, and then you find out that their shop manual was written by engineers that had never fixed a car. I don't know what was going on there. I think they were just grasping at straws trying to come up with something that would work, that they could publish. I took that thing after about a week when it kept leading me in circles and beating me up. I put it on a shelf and I started measuring voltages. And when I sent that into Ford's Best Idea contest, and I got the little plaque to hang on the wall and the $100 prize, and the very next year the shop manual came out, they had everybody measuring voltages, which I thought was very interesting. I don't know if it had anything to do with me or not, but I had a good time. Plug into every normal car. Same applies for scope patterns. If you look at scope patterns on a bunch of good cars, you'll be a lot more equipped to recognize a bad one on a car with a problem. Now learn to compare one signal in a system to another signal that should respond in a particular way. See, on your mass airflow and your throttle position, if your throttle position goes up, your mass airflow should too. Every time you gas it, you ought to see a mirror image pretty much. Now that's called rationality check. The computer does that too. And it does it with a lot of things. Like they started out, they eventually got the fuel pump, the wire leaving the relay going to the fuel pump. They connected that to pin 8 on the engine controller back in the early days. So if it told the fuel pump relay to turn on, well, pin 8 would see a ground until the fuel pump relay clicked on, then it would see power. And the engine controller could throw a code if there was no ground, you know, coming back through the fuel pump, or there was no power going out whenever it energized a relay. So that's rationality check. Correlations, here's 3 examples. An increase in idle air control should be reflected in the mass airflow. If the engine controller is telling the idle air control to pick it up, and the mass airflow doesn't reflect that it's happening, you're going to get a code for that. Opening the EGR should be reflected in lower engine vacuum readings. If I'm getting a PO401 code and I want to see what's going on, I'm going to open the EGR if I can, whether I do it with a scan tool, you know, or if I do it, if you can do it with just unplug the vacuum hose and, you know, put a hose on there, pull on it. If it raises, if you open that EGR valve and you know that EGR valve is opening, but the engine idle quality doesn't deteriorate, you know there's no flow, and that's where your PO401, you know, coming from. Dumping an air injection reactor, your air management system. If you dump that upstream, you ought to get your oxygen sensor signal ought to go down. If you're dumping it upstream, O2 going to pick up on that. The computer does that during self-test, or it used to. It would actually dump air upstream, then look for the oxygen sensor to take a dive, and just the way that it did that. All right. If the PCM doesn't see an electrical problem with the circuit, but no change happens, when the circuit's commanded, the code will be set like an incorrect gear ratio code. In other words, if it sees that a ground or whatever coming back through that transmission solenoid, and it knows it has energized that solenoid, it cannot detect an electrical fault, but it also knows what's supposed to happen when that solenoid is energized. You're going to get a performance fault. That's the way I always described it, and I think some of your shop manuals do too. Performance fault means I'm telling this solenoid to open if the solenoid is stuck or if it's just not responding or whatever, but the electrical side of that circuit is working okay, then it's basically going to know. Because see, if it tells you, if it knows what the engine RPM is, and it knows what gear it's supposed to be in, and it knows how fast the vehicle's going, it can compare those three pieces of information and tell you if it's in the right gear. And there's other things that it does, to correlate. That's just a little example. Now this one right here is a real short story I wanted to throw at you. This 86 MR2. Don't you just love working on really old cars that have expensive fuel injection parts? That's just wonderful, isn't it? All right. This one here had a rolling idle. All right. This was the mass airflow sensor. The only reason I was able to pull the top off this and look in there, somebody had already been there. And they did a lousy job of trying to glue it back on there so that you could just about lift it off there with your hand. Now I want to give you a little rundown on these. When I was looking at this mass airflow sensor, it actually didn't measure with the right resistances according to the book values, but it was $800 for a replacement sensor, so I didn't even go there. I was going to eliminate everything else before I put the $800 part on it. All right, so you might notice an interesting thing about these. You see that set of points right there? All right, that set of points is basically there to energize the fuel pump when air starts coming through. So if you're ever going to make one run, you're going to have to find the wires that feed the fuel pump through that and jumper them, which I managed to do on that one. But this is basically it's got a flapper down in there that's moved against that spring pressure, and then it's got a wiper that goes on this resistive paint. I mean, it's not really that complicated, but it's doggone expensive. When I was working at the Volkswagen place, what we were supposed to do on those was we were supposed to adjust them using an exhaust gas analyzer until they were reading 1% CO2. And that was the way that we adjusted the little adjustment screw on that. All right, now this right here, this little hole right here goes through the idle air control. All right, and it was hunting. The idle was hunting up and down, up and down. I also noticed the timing was moving with that, but I don't know if it was a cause or effect. But when I partially with the mass airflow sensor jumped out, so the fuel pump would run with the mass airflow sensor unplugged, or that vane airflow sensor is what the right name it is. Anyway, I partially covered that hole and it smoothed out. So I knew whatever was going on was going, it didn't like the high speed that was going through that idle air control, and it was trying to fix it with the timing. That's what the deal was on that, because these things have wacky strategies. All right, this is the idle air control right here. That's a new one that we actually bought. Inside this idle air control, why they always like to do this in the Japanese, Asian world, I don't know, but they love to put a wax pellet in there. It's the wackiest thing I've ever seen anybody do. I never really got that, why do you use a wax pellet to make an idle air control? On some of these Asian vehicles, the idle air control will cost $500 or $600. But the old electrical one on a GM or a Ford or a Dodge will cost 50 or 60 bucks, maybe less than 100 every time. So why in the world do they put that extra technology on there? Because the ones on Toyotas are not that way. They're fully electric and they don't hardly ever give any trouble. So anyway, what I had here, I took the water pipe loose that was going to this little thing, and I found an air bubble there. There was no flow. It didn't have any hot water to work its wax pellet. All right, there was a hose here that I didn't picture, but we were able to actually get into this unit here. See, it was supposed to come out of here and go through there. The only way you're going to make that happen is there has to be some kind of restriction. And so what I did was I got a 10 millimeter nut. Now that's the size of the, that's not the size of the wrench. The outside was 17 millimeter. But I took that 10 millimeter nut right in there and I created a restriction, and boy, that coolant really started zooming through there then. Because the pressure rises here, it goes through, and it gets pulled into the other side. That took care of the entire problem. That's all I had to do on that one to stop all that hunting. Now, it took me a long time to get there, but when I finally figured it out, putting a nut right in there so that it created a restriction. Think about the Ford DPFE system, it basically measures on both sides of a restrictor like that to see if you got EGR flowing. That's the end. I just wanted to share a little bit of that. I've had that one on my desktop for a while, and I fleshed it out last night with some extra stuff that I had. Once again, I hope you got something out of that. I always appreciate comments and things. I really thank you for watching my videos. And just thank you for all you do out there.